Good evening. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Gavel and Grace, where we tend to do two episodes. We do one that is a historical episode and another one that is a more current episode dealing with true crime. And the first episode that I'm going to do right now is about Elizabeth Short, the story behind the Black Dahlia murders. And you probably are familiar with that because it's almost like a cultish kind of, like a cult classic kind of thing. So Gavel and Grace is me analyzing things as an attorney and a criminal defense attorney that I've been for approximately 17 years. So we are going to dive right in. So essentially, imagine you're walking a quiet Los Angeles street at dawn and you spot what looks like a mannequin lying in the weeds. Then you realize it's a young woman, naked, her body cut in half, and no drop of blood around. That was January 15th, 1947, and the young woman was 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. The murder would become one of America's most infamous unsolved cases. Welcome to the True Crime Gavel. I'm Buffy, and today we dive deep into the Black Dahlia case, the life of Elizabeth Short, the chilling crime scene, the mystery surrounding her death, and the many theories and suspects that followed. So call to action. Before we get started, if you love digging into cold case and true crime mysteries, hit subscribe and leave a review so we can keep bringing you stories like this. Now, let's begin. The victim, Elizabeth Short, let's talk about her. Elizabeth Ann Short was born July 29th, 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters. Her father left when she was young and the family faced hardship. But by her early 20s, she had moved to California with dreams of Hollywood, acting or modeling, though no major credits. By January 1947, she was 22, living in Los Angeles, living modestly and trying to break into the industry. As you know, the industry is the acting industry. She had worked as a waitress, moved between hotels and apartments, and had known a number of men in LA area, as investigators discovered. So ultimately, I think that we need to take certain elements of her story with a grain of salt, given the fact that it was a different time era. And so when there's mentioning, trying to almost smear her by saying that, she knew multiple men and she did this and she was trying to be an actress and she was trying to, ultimately as a single woman, as a person who had probably dealt with abandonment issues, given that her father had left when she was young, she may have been susceptible to wanting the affection of a man or wanting to feel attractive and having those abandonment issues. So we need to look at that as something that is not necessarily a character flaw, but look at it as making her more human. And ultimately, and sadly, maybe that actually made her vulnerable and almost like a target, unfortunately. Elizabeth was described by friends and family as ambitious, a young woman chasing a big dream, not simply the caricature often portrayed in sensational press. And not to mention, her body was degraded. I mean, the fact that she was cut in half and the fact that all of that was made, there's so many things floating around about her that it's really difficult to separate sometimes truth from fiction. And as I know, a lot of people, they play telephone all day long. And those people only hear half of the story. They add another half, and then it's a mess in a game of telephone where no one gets it right. When we talk about her today, we remember more than just the crime. We remember a life cut short and a person behind the headlines. Because she had a family that loved her. She had friends that loved her. Maybe she was dating someone who loved her. We don't know. But she made an impact, even though her life was short. The crime, what happened? Discovery of the body. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a mother, Betty Bersinger, out walking with her daughter in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, saw what she thought was a mannequin. It turned out to be Elizabeth's body. The body was lying naked in a vacant lot on Norton Avenue, just a few feet from the sidewalk. Condition and gruesome details. Her body had been severed at the waist, the two halves placed separately but in line, and posed legs spread, arms thrown above her head. The body was drained of blood. Investigators noted that there was virtually no blood at the scene, indicating that the killing had happened elsewhere than the body placed there, because ultimately that had to be some sort of crime scene that was not in the area, or there would have been blood. And ultimately it kind of makes you wonder, like, did she run into some sort of surgeon, a serial killer? Like, what kind of person did she run into and then ultimately met her demise? Was she overly trusting? Like, what kind of persona did she have? And unfortunately, we don't have that information. The face had been mutilated with a Glasgow smile. If you know what Glasgow smile is, it's essentially, I don't know if you've all have watched, I think it's Sons of Anarchy. There's a guy that has that. It's like the cutting from here, and it's very gruesome and just very disturbing. So the crime scene must have been extremely disturbing, especially for that era, especially in like Hollywood and all of that other stuff, if you think about it. And then also he was trying to shame her even in death. So it kind of makes you wonder, was his motive, did he have an ultimate motive to kill her from the very beginning? Or did she shame him in some way, not blaming her, of course, shame her in some way inadvertently or whatever, and it just upset him because maybe he was a narcissist, maybe he was a sadist. Who knows? Clearly he did some of those things that just were crazy. So the Glasgow smile is like a carving, like on each side, from ear to ear in some descriptions. Skin was missing in places, and the limbs showed evidence of restraint or ligature marks and severe trauma. So you think about it, she was ultimately probably tied up, restrained, and then he did what he wanted, unfortunately. The coroner ruled she died of cerebral hemorrhage due to blows to the head and the face. So let's talk about the investigation. The murder shook LA. The press labeled her Black Dahlia, the name derived from a trend of sensational crime nicknames and perhaps an echo of the 1946 film The Blue Dahlia. The crime scene's brutality and the unanswered questions made this one of the earliest highly publicized murders in post-war America. The mystery and why it remains unsolved. Here are key factors as to why this is still unsolved. The body was moved. So the lack of blood at the scene signaled the murder occurred somewhere else where the body was placed. Then the body was placed. So ultimately, they don't even have the crime scene. If they had found the crime scene, it very likely would have been solved potentially, or there would have been witnesses or whatever. And so ultimately, if they can't find the crime scene, there's a lot of stuff that they're not going to be able to piece together. They might not be able to piece together, was this like a date? Was this a casual encounter? Was this something that they just ran into each other? Was she a victim of convenience, or did he actually know her? And so they can't really go into that. Investigators believe the killer had some skill, maybe a butcher or someone with anatomy and dissection knowledge, because he halved her essentially. He had to have some knowledge there. Elizabeth also had somewhat of a nomadic lifestyle. She moved around. She had numerous acquaintances and little consistent employment, which made tracing her steps even harder. The sensational media coverage. Newspapers raced for details, sometimes publishing lurid or inaccurate details. And ultimately, that's why it's really important now that a lot of journalists are kind of kept like on a long leash so that they're not posting information. Case in point, I think of Kaylee Anthony. I actually lived in Florida at that time with the Kaylee Anthony's murder. And I recall that Nancy Grace had came out and said, well, she essentially had that duct tape around her face and somebody put a sticker on it and gave her a blanket, and none of that was true. And it caused a lot of issues because journalists were jumping to try to get the story before anyone else. And when you do that, what usually happens, you don't do a great job. And ultimately, that can harm a case. And as a prosecutor, that is a nightmare. You want people to not have all this information. And there's stuff that's actually worse than, there's nothing worse, actually, I will say, than getting the wrong information, right? And oftentimes, a lot of people don't need that information. So that was another challenge they had with Elizabeth. Also, they believe that the press involvement may have hindered investigation, contaminated leads, or created false confessions. Well, also, if you look at the O.J. Simpson case, very similar, because there was an issue where they had, I believe, a DNA analyst who was mixing DNA. There was the fact that once Nicole's body was found, they actually put a sheet up over her, which caused fibers and stuff and kind of contaminated certain things and made it more difficult. So, of course, press can hinder. You know, they're going to want pictures. They're going to want to, you know, and then the other thing you think about is contaminating leads, too. Is like talking to certain people, and who knows what decorum they had back then, and the routes and the methods that they took, whether or not they were actually thinking about solving the crime or they just were trying to just kind of get through it as quickly as they could. Additionally, I know a lot of people have problems with false confessions, but ultimately they're very common. And so people believe, and oftentimes it can be a death knell when you're looking at a trial, because people will assume, oh, well, if I didn't kill someone, like, I'm not going to say that I did. But the other thing you think about is this was what do we say? Like 19, like this was like 19, excuse me, I got to look here. 1947. So Miranda was not around at that point. And if you all don't know what Miranda is when you're told, you're given your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. If you want an attorney, all that was like, Miranda versus Gates was not even on the radar. So can you imagine some of the abuse and some of the torture that some of those people experienced? 1947, prisoners, probably people who were interrogated, did not have rights at that point, I would almost say, especially with LA, because there is some issues, I think, with LA. And I think that the Rodney King and all the riots and all that kind of opened things up a little bit. So that's another factor. And I know a lot of people say, oh, I would never falsely confess. But I think ultimately we would like to think that we would not. But here's the thing. Until we're in that situation, we don't know what we're fully going to do. And then hundreds of people confessed, because there are a lot of people who want to be in the spotlight. They want to be important. They want to be famous. And so they will confess. So the police had over 150 suspects, according to some sources. Guess how many led to conviction? Because of all the false confessions, can you imagine how much they had to dig through? I mean, there was no internet. There was like typewriters and pens and paper and things like that. But I mean, that would just be pretty hefty load to have to look through. So enduring questions. Who killed Elizabeth Short? Why was her body posed so publicly? Which leads me to think that maybe there was some sort of relationship. And like I said, maybe he felt that he had to get revenge against her. Maybe she embarrassed him or something. Was the motive sexual, professional, or personal? Why was such a brutal crime left unsolved in a city like Los Angeles with major law enforcement resources? And then there comes the idea that a lot of people say, well, maybe he was connected in the community and maybe he was able to bypass police, maybe by paying someone off or bribing someone or, doing any number of things. Or maybe he even moved, right after the murder. Like maybe he didn't realize how big of a crime it was going to be. Which I would almost say that he was trying to tell the police, hey, I know more than you. I'm smarter than you. He was probably a narcissist, similarly. And then how did the media frenzy distract or derail this investigation? Well, I mean, the fact that they literally brought out 150 people who were willing to confess to this murder. Clearly, all 150 people did not do this, right? Only one did, probably. So the legacy. The case remains unsolved to this day, nearly 80 years later. The Black Dahlia murder has become part of the Hollywood myth-making. cold case lore, and cultural fascination with crimes that defy closure. Those cases drive me nuts. But I would almost be interested if there's anything they have that they could potentially like get DNA from. Probably not, because also we didn't have DNA back then. So, I mean, who knows? So let's talk about the theories and the suspects. Major suspects and theories. Robert Red Manley. He was the last person to see Elizabeth alive. He drove her to the Biltmore Hotel after a trip from San Diego and was briefly arrested. However, he passed multiple polygraphs and was released. However, polygraphs are generally not conclusive in court. So ultimately, kind of take it or leave it, they ultimately measure the level of stress. So if you're a person who can stay calm under pressure, like, you're probably not going to fail a polygraph. But if you are a person who literally gets like jittery, he was like, oh, you're clearly guilty because, you failed this. Dr. George Hodel was a Los Angeles physician whose son, a former homicide detective, Steve Hodel, has argued his father was the killer. Hodel had medical training which fits the anatomical precision theory, and he was bugged by investigators in 1950. Note, Dr. Hodel was never charged in the Black Dahlia case. And then also they looked at various butchers, surgeons, and persons with anatomical knowledge. Because of the victim's body being cut in half with surgical precision, drained of blood, some theorize the killer had medical or anatomical skill, which would be a great theory to go with. The media letter and taunt theory. After the murder, an envelope addressed to Los Angeles newspapers was received containing Elizabeth's address book and a note constructed from cutout newspaper headlines. The killer may have been seeking attention or sending a message. And there's a lot of people who want to try to get in the news. So, you never know. 150 people confessed. Clearly that was par for the course, right? There's also cover-up and police corruption theories. Some researchers argue the investigation was compromised by the LAPD. Multiple leads not followed properly or key suspects overlooked. Oof, that's difficult, isn't it? Which theory is most likely? I would say that the Dr. Hodel theory, given the fact that he was actually a physician, is compelling because it addresses several key elements: anatomical skill, opportunity, location. Yet with no definitive forensic evidence linking him or anyone else, the case remains speculation only. At the end of the day, the strongest point is the killer acted with confidence. He left little blood at the scene, and he posed the victim publicly, which suggests both boldness, planning, and probably wanting to humiliate her for whatever reason. Elizabeth Short's life and death continue to fascinate because we don't just have a crime, we have a mystery woven into the fabric of Hollywood. Ambition, anonymity, and menace. The Black Dahlia case reminds us that some shadows linger no matter how bright the spotlight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Black Dahlia murder, hit subscribe on True Crime on Grace and Gavel. And share this episode with someone who loves mysteries and drop a review. It really helps. Next week, we'll go after another case you won't want to miss. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at recovering_perfectionist_mama. I eventually will probably be doing a account for Grace and Gavel here soon. So thank you for tuning into my inaugural episode, and I'll actually be popping down another one here soon. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.